She was 4 years old, barefoot, blind, and sitting alone in the ruins of a burned farmhouse while the snow swallowed her up to the ankles. Every single person in Silver Creek had ridden past her that evening. Every single one. But the man who stopped the broken, hollow-eyed cowboy, who hadn't cared about anything in 3 years, he knelt down in the mud and the ash and the cold, and he asked her name. And the little girl smiled like she already knew he was coming. That smile destroyed him, and it saved an entire town. If this story moves you, please take a moment right now to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. And when you're done listening, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The wind off the mountains had teeth that evening. Ethan Ryder felt it cut straight through his coat as he rode the last stretch of trail into Silver Creek, his horse, a gray mare named Cora, picking her way carefully along the frozen mud road that passed for the town's main approach. He hadn't eaten since morning. He hadn't slept properly in 4 days. He wasn't sure if anyone had asked him that moment what exactly he was riding toward. Silver Creek wasn't a destination. It was just the next place on a long map of next places that had stopped meaning anything to him a long time ago. He was 41 years old, and he felt every one of those years like stones tied around his neck. The farming outskirts of town came first. Broad, flat parcels of land that should have been winter fields, but sat bare and wrong structures collapsed or burned. Fences knocked down the whole stretch, carrying that particular silence of places where people used to be. Ethan had passed through enough ruined country in his years to recognize it without thinking about it. Hard times, he told himself. Montana winters were cruel. Things fell apart. He almost kept riding. Almost. Cora stopped before he told her to. She snorted once, sharp and nervous. Her ears swiveling hard to the left, and Ethan felt the change in her body before his own eyes caught what had startled her. There was a child sitting in the snow beside the shell of a burned farmhouse. Not standing, not moving. Sitting with her small back against what remained of the front porch. Her knees pulled up to her chest. Her bare feet, Lord above, bare feet in the snow, tucked under the hem of a gray dress that had been torn at the shoulder and gone dirty a long time ago. She was holding something against her chest, with both arms wrapped around it. A metal lunchbox, the kind that farmers sent their children to school with. She was holding it the way some children held dolls, or the way grieving people held photographs. She wasn't crying. She wasn't screaming for help. She was perfectly, utterly still, except for the slight tilt of her head, the slow, careful way she turned her face toward Cora's hoofbeats as they stopped. Ethan sat on his horse for a long moment and looked at her. He looked up the road at Silver Creek's main street where lamplight was beginning to show in windows, where he could see the shapes of men moving on the boardwalk, where smoke was rising from the saloon's chimney. He looked back at the burned farmhouse. He looked back at the child. "Hey," he said. He hated how rough his voice sounded. He cleared his throat. "Hey there, little one." The girl turned her face toward him with that careful, deliberate motion again. Her eyes were open, aimed roughly in his direction. They were pale gray, almost silver, and they didn't focus on him. They didn't focus on anything. "I hear 2 heartbeats," she said. Her voice was small, but calm, perfectly clear. "Yours and the horse's." Ethan blinked. "That's right," he said slowly. "Just me and my horse." "Your horse is scared," the girl said. "She don't like fire smell, neither do I." A pause, brief and delicate. "You smell like road dust and leather, and a little bit like you haven't eaten today." He wasn't sure what to say to that. He swung down from the saddle, his boots breaking through the thin crust of snow as he landed, and he wrapped Cora's reins around the leaning post that was still standing at the edge of the ruined property. He walked toward the girl, slowly, making sure she could hear his footsteps clearly, not wanting to frighten her. "My name's Ethan," he said. "What's yours?" "Lucy," she said. "Lucy May Harper." She said the whole name the way children do when they've been taught that giving their full name to a grown-up is the proper and serious thing to do. "Are you from town?" "No, ma'am, just passing through." Good, Lucy said quietly. The men from town smell like lying. Ethan crouched down in front of her, bringing himself to her level. Up close, he could see the rawness on her feet, the way the cold had gone deep into her skin. He could see the hollows under her eyes. He could see that the metal lunchbox she was holding had been clutched so tightly so many times that her small fingers had worn the paint from the handle. "Lucy," he said, keeping his voice low and even. "Where are your people?" Lucy was quiet for a moment. She tilted her head slightly, that listening posture again, like she was reading the air around his voice. Then she said, "Mama went to talk to the sheriff 2 days ago. She said she'd be back before dark." She paused. It's been too dark since then. The cold settled differently in Ethan's chest after she said that. "And your daddy?" "Daddy died," Lucy said without flinching. The matter-of-fact way she said it wasn't hardness. It was the particular honesty of a child who has already cried everything out. Before the fire, men came and hurt him, and then there was the fire, and then he was gone. She pressed the lunchbox tighter against her chest. "But he told me what to do. He said, hold on to this and don't give it to anybody, and someday a man with a quiet voice would stop for us." Ethan felt something move in him that he hadn't felt in a long time. It moved the way a fault line moves, not dramatically, but deep down, at a level where the real structure of a person lives. "Your daddy said that?" he asked. "He made me memorize it," Lucy said, nodding seriously. "He said, Lucy May, there are men who will want what's in that box, and those men are dangerous, and you must not trust a loud voice or a friendly face from this town. But someday a man with a quiet voice will stop for you, and that man you can trust." She tilted her head again. "You have a quiet voice, mister." Ethan sat back on his heels and looked at this child 4 years old. Blind, barefoot, sitting in the ruins of her burned home in a Montana winter, holding her dead father's last instructions against her chest. And something inside him that had been locked shut for 3 years, cracked open just enough to let in a sliver of feeling. He didn't like the feeling. It was too close to the one he'd had when he'd held his own son for the last time. But he didn't push it away. "Where's your brother?" he asked. He'd guessed there was a brother. There was something in the way she spoke, a wee feeling, a sense of another presence accounted for. Lucy's expression shifted just slightly. A tightening. "Noah went looking," she said. "Looking for who?" "For the men who came back after Daddy died. He said he was going to follow them and find out where they took Mama." She was quiet for a moment. "That was yesterday morning. He said he'd be back by noon." Ethan stood up slowly. He looked up the road toward town again. The lamplight in the windows looked different now. Less like warmth. More like eyes watching. "Lucy," he said. "I'm going to pick you up and put you on my horse now, all right? I'm going to take you somewhere warm." "Are you taking me to town?" "Not yet." "Good," she said again, in that same quiet, certain voice. "I don't want to go to town until you know what's in the box." He wrapped his coat around her without asking, and lifted her onto Cora's saddle, swinging up behind her and pulling her close so the cold couldn't reach her anymore. She didn't resist. She didn't flinch. She simply leaned back against him, with the lunchbox still held firm in both arms, and she said quietly, almost to herself, "I knew you wouldn't ride past." Ethan didn't answer that. He wasn't sure he could. He rode back up the road a quarter-mile to a stand of pines where a low outcropping gave some wind shelter, and he got a fire going with the dry wood he carried. He didn't go into town. Not yet. He sat across the fire from Lucy May Harper with his coffee and listened. She talked slowly, pausing sometimes to listen to the night sounds around them, once going completely still for nearly a minute, when a group of riders moved along the distant road. She had a way of sorting sounds that was unlike anything Ethan had ever witnessed, not just hearing them, but reading them, identifying them, assigning meaning to each one, the way a tracker reads ground sign. 3 horses, she said of the riders on the road. One's limping on the right foreleg. The rider on the left has a repeating rifle. I can hear the way it sits in the scabbard, how heavy it is when the horse moves. She paused. They've ridden hard today. They're tired, but they're still paying attention." "Sheriff's men?" Ethan asked. "Probably," Lucy said simply. "They ride that road every evening, checking." "Checking what?" "Checking if we're still there," she said. "At the farm, making sure we haven't gone anywhere." A pause. "They don't know about you yet." Ethan stared into the fire. "How long have you been out there alone at the house?" "Since yesterday noon," Lucy said. She said it without complaint. "I knew moving would be dangerous. Mama said if anything ever happened, I should stay at the house and hold the box and wait. So I waited." A small pause. "It got very cold last night." He closed his eyes briefly. "It surely did," he said. She was quiet for a moment, warming her hands still wrapped in his coat near the fire's edge, the lunchbox on her knees. Then she said, "You want to know what's inside, don't you?" "I reckon I do," Ethan said. "But I won't ask you to open it unless you're ready." Lucy was quiet for a long moment. She ran her thumb along the metal clasp with a kind of reverence. "Daddy said the box had everything," she said at last. "He said, Lucy May, everything the men want is in this box, and everything that will stop them is in this box too. The same thing is both the reason and the answer." She looked up, that careful, listening look aimed somewhere between him and the fire. "I don't know exactly what that means. But Daddy was always right." "Your daddy sounds like he was a good man," Ethan said. "He was the best man," Lucy said with a finality and a certainty that made the words land like something carved in stone. Ethan added another piece of wood to the fire and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. He thought about what to say and discarded several things before he settled on the truth. "Lucy," he said, "I used to work for the federal government. I was a ranger. I investigated corruption, men in power doing wrong things to people who didn't have power to fight back." Lucy turned her face toward him, listening hard. "I'm not that anymore," he said. "I quit. I had reasons." He wasn't going to go into those reasons tonight. Maybe not ever. "But I know how to look at what's in a box like that and understand what it means. I know the right people to send it to. And I know how to find a missing boy and a missing woman if anyone does." He paused. "I'm not promising you anything I don't know I can keep, but I'm telling you what I am." Lucy was quiet for a long time, long enough that the fire settled and sparked and the distant sound of the riders faded entirely into the dark. Then she said, "Daddy said he'd send someone." Ethan felt that fault line move again. "He said he was going to pray every night until someone came," Lucy continued, "and that the Lord would send somebody who already knew what to look for because they'd looked for it before. Somebody who had a reason to care about this kind of wrong." She tilted her head slightly. "He said that person would be carrying a sadness they hadn't set down yet." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Are you carrying a sadness, Mr. Ethan?" Lucy asked. He wasn't going to lie to a 4-year-old. "Yes," he said. "I thought so," she said gently. "It's in your voice, underneath the quiet." She looked back toward the fire. "That's okay. Daddy said it would be. He said sadness doesn't mean broken. He said sometimes it just means somebody who knows what it costs to lose something." A small pause. "He said that kind of person fights hardest." Ethan Ryder sat with that for a while. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the dark an owl called once and went silent. The mountains stood enormous and cold against the night sky. After a while he said, "What's your brother like?" Lucy's face softened immediately. "Noah is brave and stupid," she said in the voice of someone who has said this exact combination of words many times before and means both halves of it completely. "He's 11, and he thinks being 11 means being a man. He used to carry me on his back to school every morning because Mama said I should go, even though some kids were mean about my eyes." A pause. "He punched a boy in the nose once for calling me a name. Mama was so angry, but I heard her laugh about it later when she thought I was asleep." Ethan smiled just a little. It surprised him, the smile. He hadn't expected it. "He'll be all right," Ethan said. "We'll find him." "I know," Lucy said with a confidence that was either faith or stubbornness, or possibly both. "He's loud when he's scared, but he gets quiet when he's in real trouble." I'm more worried about him being in real trouble than being scared." A small frown creased her face. The men he was following, Noah, didn't know about those men the way Daddy knew. He was just angry. "Tell me about these men," Ethan said. "Tell me everything you know." Lucy opened the lunchbox. She did it with both hands, slow and careful, and she reached inside without looking. She was always without looking, and she took out a folded sheaf of papers wrapped in oilcloth. She held them out toward him. "I can't read them," she said, "but Daddy read them to me once. He said, 'Lucy May, I want you to hear these words even if you can't see them, because someday you might have to tell someone what they say.'" She paused. "I remember everything I hear." Ethan took the papers from her hands carefully. He moved closer to the firelight and unfolded the oilcloth and read. He read slowly. He read carefully. And the more he read, the more that cold weight in his chest became something else, something sharper and more purposeful. The documents were meticulous. Whoever had assembled them, and he had a feeling it was Lucy's father working quietly and at great personal risk for a long time, had done the work of a man who knew he was building a case that had to stand on its own after he was gone. Land deeds copied and compared with public records. Signature forgeries identified with notations in a careful hand. Bank transfer records, dates and amounts, names of officials marked with small, precise asterisks. Lists, names, numbers, and a sheriff at the center of all of it. A sheriff named Caleb Greer. Ethan had heard that name before. He hadn't expected to hear it out here. "Lucy," he said carefully. "Your daddy. What was his name?" "Robert James Harper," Lucy said. Ethan looked at the handwriting on the documents. He thought about a federal corruption case from years back, a case that had been opened and then quietly closed before it reached trial, closed by people above him and over his objections, and the way that closing had been one of the 3 or 4 things that had finally made him walk away from the badge entirely. In that case, there had been whispers of a network stretching from a Billings banking house westward into the rural counties, a network of sheriff's offices and land offices and private investors working together to quietly collapse family farms and consolidate the land at catastrophic loss to the original owners. The investigation had been shut down before anyone had found the documentation to prove it. He was looking at that documentation now. Robert James Harper had spent years, maybe his whole adult life, building the case that federal investigators had been unable to build. And then he had put it in a metal lunchbox and pressed it into the arms of his 4-year-old blind daughter and told her to wait. Ethan folded the oilcloth back around the papers and held them for a moment before handing them back to Lucy. She tucked them away with practiced hands, closed the latch, and held the box against her chest again. "You know what's in there," she said. It wasn't a question. "I do," he said. "Is it enough?" He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "It's enough." Lucy exhaled a long, slow breath that carried something in it, something like the sound of a weight being partially set down. "Daddy said it was enough," she said. "He said this is enough to bring the whole thing down, Lucy May. He just needed somebody to bring it to." "He found somebody," Ethan said. Lucy was quiet for a moment. Then, "He's not here anymore to know that." "No," Ethan said. "But you are, and you'll be able to tell him someday." Lucy tilted her face up slightly toward where she could feel the warmth of the fire on her skin. She was quiet for a while, and Ethan watched her and thought about his son, about the particular stillness of a child at rest, the way it looked like peace, even when it wasn't. He thought about his wife. He thought about all the roads between then and now, and what any of it had been worth, and whether it had been worth anything at all. He had asked himself that question in every dark hour for 3 years running. He had never had an answer. He was sitting beside a burned-out farmhouse fire with a 4-year-old blind girl in his coat who was holding the document that could finally break open the worst case of institutional corruption he had ever seen in his career, a career he had walked away from because he'd believed the institution was too rotten to be worth his effort anymore. He thought about what Lucy's father had said about sadness. He thought maybe this is what it was for. He didn't say that out loud. It felt too large and too raw to say out loud. But he thought it, and somewhere inside him, in the place where purpose lives when it's been dormant a long time, something stirred. "All right, Lucy May Harper," he said quietly. "Here's what we're going to do. Tonight you sleep warm and I keep watch. First light, I start asking questions in that town. Careful questions, quiet ones, the kind that don't tell anybody what I'm looking for. And I will find your brother." Lucy was already leaning against his side, the lunchbox between her arms, her eyes closed. She was exhausted in the way of someone who has been holding themselves upright through sheer will for a very long time and has just barely decided it might be safe to let go. "I know," she murmured. "I haven't made you a promise yet," Ethan said. "You don't have to," she said, already half asleep. "You already stopped." Outside the pine stand, the Montana night pressed down heavy and cold and enormous, and the lights of Silver Creek burned in the distance like eyes that didn't blink. Ethan Ryder wrapped his arm around the small sleeping child with the lunchbox, and he watched those lights, and he thought about everything he'd stopped believing in 3 years ago. He hadn't expected to believe in anything again. He was beginning to think that might have been wrong. Silver Creek woke up mean. Ethan had seen plenty of towns in his years, and he could read them the way other men read weather, the angle of shoulders, the spacing between people on a boardwalk, the particular way eyes moved when a stranger walked in. Some towns had the easy looseness of a place that trusted itself. Some had the tight-wound nervousness of a place that was waiting for something bad to happen. And some, the worst kind, the kind that left marks on a man long after he'd ridden through, had the hollow, practiced blankness of a place that had already decided not to see what was happening right in front of it. Silver Creek was the third kind. He'd left Lucy sleeping under blankets in a sheltered hollow, half a mile from the main road. Cora hobbled nearby, the lunchbox, tucked so deep inside the bedroll that finding it would require knowing exactly what to look for. Lucy had woken briefly when he pulled on his coat and told him without opening her eyes. "The man at the feed store knows something. He was kind to Mama once. His boots squeak on the left side." Then she'd gone back to sleep like she hadn't said anything unusual at all. Ethan had stood there for a moment staring at her, and then he'd walked toward town. The feed store was easy enough to find. Most things in a town this size were. He pushed through the door, and the bell above it rang once, and the man behind the counter looked up and immediately looked back down at what he was doing, which was the involuntary response of a man who had trained himself not to make eye contact with strangers. His left boot squeaked when he shifted his weight. "Morning," Ethan said. "Morning," the man said without looking up. He was somewhere past 50 thick through the shoulders, with the particular quality of someone who had once been physically brave and had spent years since then teaching himself to be smaller. Ethan set a coin on the counter. "Bag of oats?" he said. "And a question, if you're willing." The man's eyes flicked to the coin, then to Ethan's face, then back down. "Oats I got," he said. "Questions I'm short on. Harper family," Ethan said quietly. "Robert Harper's wife. Margaret, I'd guess from the age of the children. You know her?" The man went absolutely still. Not the stillness of someone who didn't know the name. The stillness of someone who knew it very well and was deciding in real time how afraid to be. "Don't know any Harpers," he said. "Left boot says different," Ethan said. The man looked up. His jaw was tight, but his eyes had something in them that wasn't hostility. It was closer to pain. "Mr.," he said, low and careful, "I got a wife and 3 daughters in this town. I got a store that's been in my family 20 years. Whatever you're looking for, I can't help you find it." "I'm not looking for trouble," Ethan said. "I'm looking for a boy, 11 years old. His sister's out in the cold waiting on him." Something moved across the man's face. His throat worked. "Lucy," he said, barely above a whisper. It wasn't a question. "She's safe," Ethan said. "For now." The man set down what he was holding. He walked to the front window and looked out at the street for a long moment. Then he came back and leaned across the counter and said very quietly, "The boy went to the rail yard. Old switching yard east of town, abandoned 3 years now. Deputies use it." A pause. "For things they don't want done in town." Ethan felt his jaw tighten. He alive? Lord, I hope so, the man said, and the way he said it carried the weight of someone who had seen what happened at that rail yard before and didn't carry the memory lightly. He got out there yesterday morning early. 2 of Greer's men saw him following them. Kids fast got into the rail yard before they caught him inside. He exhaled slowly. They didn't bring him back through town. I don't know what that means. It means he's still there, Ethan said. Means they're not done with him yet. The man stared at him. Who are you? Somebody who already knows about Caleb Greer, Ethan said simply. The man went pale, genuinely pale in the way that has nothing to do with the cold. He stepped back from the counter and shook his head once. Get out of my store, he said, not with hostility, with something closer to terror. Please, don't come back. Don't say that name in here. I understand, Ethan said. He picked up the bag of oats and left the coin. At the door he stopped without turning around. The Harper family didn't have anybody, he said. Until now. I just want you to know that. He walked out before the man could answer. The street was filling up with the morning's ordinary business, and Ethan moved through it with his hat pulled and his eyes doing the work they'd been trained to do, cataloging, sorting, measuring. He counted 2 deputies he was fairly certain were deputies by the way they stood and the way people adjusted their paths to avoid them. He noted the sheriff's office windows lit, horse-tied out front that hadn't been there long. He noted the bank, the largest and newest building on the street, with the name Western Valley Land and Trust etched into the stone above the door in the self-important lettering of an institution that wanted to seem permanent. He was still watching the bank when someone walked into him from the side. Not an accident. The man was built wide with a face like a boot heel and eyes that had the professional flatness of someone paid to look at other people and decide what to do about them. He was wearing a deputy's badge, and he didn't apologize for the collision. Don't believe I've seen you before, the deputy said. Passing through, Ethan said. Passing through to where? Wherever the road goes, Ethan said pleasantly. That's the nature of passing through. The deputy looked him over slowly, the practiced, insulting thoroughness of a man who wanted the other man to feel examined. You got business in Silver Creek? Oats, Ethan said and held up the bag. The deputy's eyes didn't change. What's your name? Ethan had 3 names he used for occasions like this. He picked the middle one. Cole, he said. James Cole, out of Wyoming. The deputy stared at him for another few seconds. Then he stepped back and let him pass. But Ethan felt the man's eyes on his back all the way down the boardwalk, and he walked at exactly the same unhurried pace the whole way, because the fastest way to make a man suspicious was to walk like you were trying not to run. He ducked between 2 buildings and stood in the narrow gap and let himself breathe for a moment. He thought about the rail yard. He thought about Noah Harper, 11 years old, brave and stupid in the words of his 4-year-old sister, and what a boy that age would do when he was scared and trapped and didn't know if anyone was coming. He thought about what men like Greer's deputies did to people who knew too much. He moved. He came back to Lucy by a different route, longer and quieter, and she was sitting up with the lunchbox on her lap when he arrived, her head tilted at the particular angle she used when she was listening to something far off. 2 men on horses left town going east 20 minutes ago, she said immediately before he could speak. They were riding fast, not patrol fast, urgent fast. Ethan crouched beside her. The rail yard's east of town, he said. I know, Lucy said. Her voice was steady, but her hands had tightened on the lunchbox. That's where Noah is, isn't it? It wasn't a question, but he answered it anyway. That's what I'm told. I'm going out there. I'm coming, she said, and started to stand. Lucy, I won't slow you down, she said, with a flatness that was not negotiable. I know how to be quiet. I know how to stay still, and I can hear things out there that you can't. She paused. You know that's true. He did know that. He'd known it since she'd told him about the riders on the road the night before with the precision of a field scout. He looked at her for a moment, this 4-year-old, with her bare feet and her blind eyes and her dead father's lunchbox, and he thought about all the ways this could go wrong. "You stay on Cora," he said. "And you do exactly what I say the moment I say it." "Yes, sir," Lucy said immediately with the crisp certainty of someone who had already won and was being gracious about it. He put her up on Cora, and they moved east along the tree line, away from the road, and Lucy sat in the saddle with her chin slightly raised and her eyes closed. She closed them when she was concentrating. He'd noticed as though shutting out the useless visual information helped the rest of her senses sharpen, and she narrated the world around them in a low, steady murmur that was unlike anything Ethan had ever experienced riding with another person. "Creek to our left 30 yards. You can ford it at the wide part without losing time." A pause. "Bird flushed hard from those trees ahead. Something moved through there recently. Not an animal. Two-legged." Another pause. "One of the horses that went east is tied up somewhere close. I can hear it shifting. Nervous horse." Ethan slowed Cora to a walk. "How close?" "Close enough that I'd say we stop here and go the rest on foot," Lucy said. He stopped. He got down and lifted her down, and he tied Cora to a branch, and he carried Lucy on his back through the last stretch of scrub brush, moving low and slow. The rail yard came into view through the brush. Not that Lucy needed to see it, and Ethan went still. There were 3 men he could count, plus horses. An old switching shed door hanging open. And from inside the shed came a sound that hit Ethan like a physical force. A boy's voice, trying very hard not to cry, and mostly succeeding, but not entirely. Lucy's hand tightened on Ethan's shoulder. She didn't make a sound, but he felt her whole body go rigid. "That's Noah," she whispered. "I know," he said. "They're hurting him," she said. "Not for much longer," Ethan said. One of the 3 men outside was the wide-faced deputy from the street. He was talking to another man who had the bearing of someone accustomed to giving instructions rather than taking them older, better dressed than a working deputy, had any business being with the particular posture of authority. The 3rd man was watching the road. Ethan listened. "Can't keep him here. The whole point was information," the well-dressed man was saying, his voice carrying the careful clipping of someone educated in a place that thought itself better than Montana. "Does the boy actually know what's in those documents or not?" "Says he doesn't," the deputy said. "Says the blind girl has the box and doesn't know what's in it." "The blind girl is 4 years old," the well-dressed man said with a kind of contemptuous certainty. "She's a child. She can't read. Harper could have told her things." "Harper is dead," the man said flatly. "His wife is being held, and she hasn't said anything useful in 2 days. The boy knows something or he doesn't. Either way, he's a problem." The word problem, spoken in that tone, in that context, landed on Ethan's chest like a boot. He'd heard men talk about people as problems before. He knew what solutions those men reached for. He counted exits. He counted positions. He did the arithmetic of a man who had done this kind of arithmetic for years and had quit doing it, and now found it coming back to him the way all old training does automatically before he'd decided to let it. "Stay here," he told Lucy. He set her down behind a wide-trunked pine, pressed her back against it. "Do not move unless I come back and tell you it's safe. You understand me?" "Yes," she said. Then, "Mr. Ethan." "What?" "There are only 3 of them," she said. "And one has a bad knee. He favors his right side when he walks. I can hear it in his step." He stared at her. "Left side is his weak side," she said. Ethan stood up straight. He breathed in once, slow and deep, the way he used to before situations like this. The old reflex, the ranger's reflex, coming back into his body, like a key turning in a lock. Then he walked out of the brush and straight toward the 3 men in the rail yard, and he walked at the same unhurried pace he'd used on the boardwalk, and he held his hands loose at his sides. And when the man watching the road turned and saw him and went for his gun, Ethan said very calmly, "I wouldn't." There is a tone of voice that certain men develop after years of doing certain kinds of work, not loud, not threatening in any obvious way, but carrying in it a quality of absolute seriousness that communicates without elaboration that the person speaking is not acting and is not afraid and has been exactly here before. Ethan Ryder had that voice in full measure, and when he used it, the man watching the road stopped with his hand on his gun and didn't draw. The deputy turned. The well-dressed man turned. And the well-dressed man looked at Ethan Ryder's face, and something happened behind his eyes that was not fear exactly but was adjacent to it. Recognition and calculation happening simultaneously. "I know you," the man said slowly. Ethan said nothing. "You're—" The man stopped himself. His eyes narrowed. "You used to be a ranger, federal." A pause working through it. "Ryder. You're Ethan Ryder." The deputy's hand tightened on his gun. "The boy comes out of that shed walking under his own power," Ethan said, "and we have a conversation. Or we skip the conversation and I do this the other way. I'll leave it to you." The well-dressed man was very still. He was thinking. Ethan could see him thinking, running the angles, calculating the exposure, trying to determine what a former federal ranger knew and how he'd come to be standing in an abandoned Montana rail yard, asking about a Harper boy. "You have no jurisdiction here," the man said finally. "You're no longer a ranger." "That's true," Ethan said. "I'm just a man asking about a child." He kept his eyes on the man's face. "But I do have a very complete set of documents that a very thorough man spent a very long time putting together, and I know exactly who to send them to. And right now the difference between whether those documents leave this county or don't leave this county is standing right in front of you." Silence. The distant sound of wind. Somewhere in the shed, Noah Harper had gone very quiet, listening the way his sister listened, straining toward the voices outside. The well-dressed man looked at Ethan Ryder, and Ethan looked back, and the arithmetic of the moment sat between them like a stone. Then from inside the shed, Noah's voice came out cracked and rough and trying like hell to sound steady. "Mr. Whoever you are out there, I'm Noah Harper. My sister's name is Lucy. She's got a lunchbox and she's blind and she's 4 years old, and if anything happens to me, you have to find her. You hear me? You have to find her." Ethan didn't take his eyes off the well-dressed man, but his jaw moved, just once. "I already found her son," he said. The silence that followed was the loudest silence Ethan had heard in a long time. And then slowly, the well-dressed man took his hand away from his coat. The well-dressed man's name was Douglas Hale. Ethan learned that in the first 30 seconds after the standoff broke, when Hale straightened his coat with the practiced composure of a man accustomed to regaining his footing quickly after an unexpected fall. He had the smooth, controlled face of a banker or a lawyer, the kind of face that had never needed to show what it was actually thinking, because the people around it had always been paid to agree with it regardless. "You're making a significant mistake," Hale said quietly. "Whatever you think you have in those documents, whatever Harper put together in whatever delusion he was operating under, it won't hold in any court in this territory. I have relationships with every judge from here to Helena." "That's a lot of judges," Ethan said. "Federal court's a longer ride." Hale's eyes moved fractionally. "You'd need federal standing to bring a federal case." "I've got federal contacts," Ethan said. "Badge or no badge, some friendships don't expire." He kept his voice even, the way he kept it, even when there was nothing even about the situation at all. "Now I'd like the boy." Hale looked at him for another long moment. Then he turned his head slightly toward the deputy. "Let him out." The deputy didn't move immediately. He was looking at Ethan with something close to hatred. Not the hot kind, but the professional kind, the kind that files itself away for later use. "Mr. Hale." "Let him out," Hale repeated. The deputy walked to the shed door and pulled it open, and Noah Harper came out into the light. He was 11 years old, and he had his father's jaw, and his mother's eyes, and a split lip and dried blood on the side of his face from where something or someone had connected with him hard enough to leave a mark. He was holding himself upright through sheer refusal to do otherwise, chin up, shoulders back the way of a boy who had decided that showing pain in front of these men was something he would not do even if it killed him. He looked at Ethan. He looked at Hale. He looked back at Ethan. "You're not one of them," he said. "No," Ethan said. "You said you found Lucy." Noah's voice cracked on the name, and he didn't try to hide it. You said that. Is she all right? She's safe, half a mile back waiting on us. Ethan held the boy's gaze steady. She's been waiting for you since yesterday morning. Something broke across Noah Harper's face. Not weakness, but the sudden collapse of a thing that had been holding itself together under enormous pressure for a very long time. He breathed in once, sharp and hard, and then he set his jaw, and it was gone, pressed back down with the same determination that had kept him standing in that shed. Let's go then, he said. Hale's voice followed them as they turned. Ryder. Low, precise. Not a warning exactly, more like a marker being placed. You've involved yourself in something that has been moving for a long time. You can't stop it by yourself. Ethan stopped walking but didn't turn around. I'm not by myself, he said, and he walked Noah Harper out of the rail yard. They moved fast through the brush, Noah limping slightly but keeping pace, and before they'd covered 50 yards, Ethan heard Lucy's voice from behind the pine tree, not calling out, because she had too much good sense for that, but a low and urgent whisper, Noah, loose. Noah broke into a run despite the limp and dropped to his knees in front of his sister and grabbed her in both arms, and Lucy dropped the lunchbox in the snow and wrapped both arms around her brother's neck and held on with everything she had. Neither of them made a sound for a long moment. They just held on. Ethan picked up the lunchbox and stood a few feet off and watched and let them have it. Then Lucy pulled back and put both hands on her brother's face, the way she read everything with careful reading fingers. She touched the swollen lip, the dried blood on his temple. Her expression tightened with something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but held something of both. They hit you, she said. I'm fine, Noah said. They hit you, she said again, with a flatness that was not about the hitting. It was about who hit him, and why, and what it meant about a world that would do that to an 11-year-old boy. Lucy. Noah caught her hands in his. Did you do it? Did you hold on to the box the whole time? Yes, she said. Did you give it to anyone? No, she said. I waited like Daddy said. A pause. He came, Noah, just like Daddy said he would. Noah looked up at Ethan with those mother's eyes of his, sharp and assessing, older than 11 in the way of children who have been required to grow up ahead of schedule. You read the documents, he said. I did, Ethan said. Then you know about Greer, and Hale, and the others. I know enough, Ethan said. I need to know the rest. Your mother, what exactly did she do? Who did she try to report to? Noah stood up, still holding Lucy's hand. She went to the sheriff's office, he said, which was stupid because Greer is the whole problem, but she didn't have anyone else to go to. She took copies she'd made of some of the documents, not the originals. She knew to keep those separate, and she walked in there and told Greer she had evidence of land fraud going back 8 years. He paused. That was 2 days ago. They kept her. On what charge? They called it disturbing the peace, Noah said, and his voice carried all the contempt an 11-year-old can pack into 4 words, which is more than most adults manage. They said she was hysterical, making false accusations against county officials. He paused again. She's in the jail cells at the back of the sheriff's office. I saw them take her in. I was watching from the alley. Ethan thought about that. About Margaret Harper sitting in a cell 2 days deep, not knowing if her children were alive or dead. About what kind of woman would walk into Caleb Greer's office with those documents in her hand, knowing full well who she was walking toward. He thought about what kind of woman Robert Harper had chosen to build his life with, and he thought it was probably no accident that a man that deliberate and careful had picked someone equally brave. We need to move, Ethan said. Hale will go to Greer. We've got maybe an hour before this gets complicated. It's already complicated, Noah said. More complicated, Ethan said. Get on the horse. They rode hard back toward town by the tree line, Ethan with Lucy in front of him and Noah up behind. And Lucy was quiet the whole way, with her head up and her eyes closed, and her listening posture fully engaged. She spoke twice. Once to tell him there were no riders between them and town yet. Once to say, "Mr. Ethan, what are you going to do?" "I'm going to talk to some people," he said. "What people?" "The ones Hale and Greer haven't managed to make completely afraid yet," he said. "There's always some. In every town, no matter how bad it gets, there's always some." Lucy was quiet for a moment. "The man at the feed store," she said. Ethan glanced sideways at her. "You knew about him." "He used to stop and talk to Mama," Lucy said. "He was kind. His voice always sounded sorry, like he wanted to do more than he was doing." A pause. "Guilty people and kind people sound different. He was both." "He was afraid," Ethan said. "He's still both," Lucy said. "Fear doesn't take away the kind." Ethan filed that away in the place where he kept things that were simply and exactly right. He left the children with Cora tied in the narrow lane behind the feed store and went in through the back. The man, his name turned out to be Gerald Marsh, which Ethan extracted from him in the first 30 seconds, looked up from his inventory when the back door opened and went pale for the second time that morning. "I told you," he started. "Margaret Harper is in the jail cells," Ethan said. "Her son has a split lip and a bruised temple from Hale's deputies. Her daughter is 4 years old and has been sitting in the snow for 2 days waiting." He let that sit for exactly 3 seconds. "I need to know who else in this town has been sitting with something they want to say and haven't said it." Gerald Marsh stared at him. His throat worked. "You don't understand what Greer does to people who talk." "I understand perfectly," Ethan said. "I also understand what happens to a town that stays quiet long enough. You end up with nothing left to protect." He stepped closer. "The documents are real, Mr. Marsh. I've read them. They're complete enough to bring federal investigation down on Silver Creek within the week if I can get them out of this county tonight. But I'm not leaving without that woman, and I'm not leaving without giving the people in this town the chance to do what they should have done a long time ago." He paused. "So I'll ask you again, who else?" Gerald Marsh looked at the back door, looked at the front window, looked at his hands. Then he exhaled like a man putting down something that had been crushing him slowly for years and said, "Widow Calloway on the North End. She lost her farm 2 years ago. Greer had it condemned on false structural claims, and Hale's land company bought it at 1/10 of the value. She's been waiting ever since." He stopped. "Tom Briggs, the blacksmith. His brother was one of the ones who tried to fight it early on. He disappeared." Another pause. 3 other families on the East Road. The Suttons, the Flemings, the Reyes family. All lost land. All still in town because they've got nowhere else to go. And none of them know each other's situation, Ethan said. "Greer made sure of that," Gerald said. "Kept everyone separate. If you don't know you're not alone, you stay alone." His jaw worked. That was always the whole point. Ethan nodded slowly. "Is there a church in this town? Presbyterian, far end of Main Street." "Get word to those families," Ethan said. "Tonight, after dark. Tell them there's a man at the church who has evidence and a plan and needs witnesses." He looked at Gerald steadily. "You can do it quietly. You're the feed store. Every family in this county has reason to come through your door." Gerald Marsh looked at him for a long moment. "If this goes wrong, it won't go wrong," Ethan said. And he said it not because he was certain, but because the alternative was a thing he refused to put in his voice. What happened next moved fast the way things do once a stone starts rolling down a hill and gravity takes the decision out of everyone's hands. By midday, Ethan had spoken to Tom the blacksmith directly and found a man who had been clenching his grief into a fist for 2 years and was ready desperately and completely ready to open his hand. By early afternoon, Gerald Marsh had moved through his deliveries with the quiet efficiency of a man who had finally found a use for all that guilty kindness, and the word had spread in the careful, untrackable way that word spreads in small communities that have learned to communicate under surveillance. The sheriff's office was the problem Ethan kept coming back to. He couldn't walk in and demand Margaret Harper's release, not without triggering Greer immediately, not without tipping the whole balance before the evening's gathering could happen. He needed her out, but he needed it done quietly enough that Greer didn't know the situation had shifted until it was too late to stop it. It was Lucy who solved it. He told her the problem, the way he'd found himself telling her things directly without softening it, because she had a way of responding to softened information by cutting straight to the unsoft version anyway. She listened with her eyes closed, and then she said, "Does Greer know you have the documents?" "Hale will have told him by now," Ethan said. "Then Greer knows the documents exist and knows you have them," she said. "Which means the most dangerous thing to him right now isn't Mama. The most dangerous thing is you." A pause. "If he thinks he can get the documents back by releasing Mama as a gesture like he's showing you he's reasonable, he might do it. To buy time." Ethan looked at her. "You're suggesting I offer him a trade he thinks is in his favor." "I'm suggesting you let him think he's smart," Lucy said. Noah made a sound. "She does that to me all the time," he said. "It is deeply annoying." Ethan wrote a note. 3 sentences. He had Gerald Marsh's youngest boy deliver it to the sheriff's office, on the pretense of a feed bill slipped under the door, with the boy knowing nothing about what it said. The note read, "I have Harper's documents. I want no part of Silver Creek's business. Release the woman, and I ride out by morning." The lie was functional. The truth was the opposite of every word in it. Margaret Harper walked out of the sheriff's office 40 minutes later. She was thinner than she should have been, and her dress had the particular wrinkles of someone who'd slept in it on a cot in a cold room, and she came around the corner of the alley behind the feed store and saw her children and made a sound that Ethan had to look away from, because it was the sound of a thing he had lost and would never have again. Lucy ran to her voice, and Noah caught them both, and the 3 of them stood in the cold mud of the alley, holding on the way the Harper family knew how to hold on with everything, holding nothing back. Ethan stood apart and gave them their moment and tried to feel nothing and failed. After a while, Margaret Harper looked up and found his eyes across the alley. She was not a small woman in any sense of the word. She had Robert Harper's careful stubbornness written in her face, and the particular steadiness of someone who had been prepared long before the crisis hit to survive it. "You're the one," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "You read the documents." "Yes, ma'am." "Then you know it's not just Greer and Hale," she said. "There are names in their county commissioners, 2 state legislators, a federal land officer." She held his gaze. "This is bigger than Silver Creek." "I know," Ethan said. "Then you know Greer will come tonight," she said. "Once he figures out you didn't ride out, once Hale tells him what happened at the rail yard, they'll come with everyone they have." "I know that too," Ethan said. Margaret Harper looked at her children once more, brief and fierce, and then she looked back at Ethan. "Then what's the plan?" "We put every family that's been hurt by these men in the same room tonight," he said. "We let them hear the documents read out loud. We let them see that they're not alone and never were. And when Greer walks in with his deputies to shut it down," he paused, "he won't find one man with a box of papers. He'll find a room full of witnesses who've already heard everything." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "You're betting Greer won't use violence on a church full of families." "I'm betting Greer is smart enough to know what happens to a man who does," Ethan said. "And I'm betting Hale is standing right next to him, reminding him exactly what that looks like to the federal government." "And if you're wrong," Ethan looked at her steadily, "then I'm standing between him and everyone in that church," he said. "And I've been standing in harder places than that." Lucy's hand found his from somewhere beside him. Small and certain, wrapping around 2 of his fingers, the way a child holds something precious, without making a production of it. He looked down at her. She was facing forward toward the direction of the church. Her chin slightly raised her expression, carrying the particular calm of someone who has already weighed the thing and accepted the weight of it. "He'll come," she said quietly. "I'll hear him before anyone else does." "I know you will," Ethan said. The sun was dropping fast toward the western mountains when they walked toward the church, and behind them, one by one, the families of Silver Creek began to move in the same direction, quietly separately, by different routes, the way people move when they've been afraid for a long time, and are doing a brave thing for the first time. And ahead of them, in the sheriff's office, Caleb Greer was reading the note a second time, and beginning to understand that he'd made a mistake. The Presbyterian church at the far end of Main Street had not been full on a weekday evening in years. Gerald Marsh came first with his hat in his hands and his guilty kindness wearing the unfamiliar shape of courage. Tom the blacksmith came next, still in his work apron, with soot on his forearms and the particular stillness of a man who had decided something irrevocable on the walk over. The Sutton family came in through the side door, both parents and 3 grown children, all of them carrying the hollowed-out look of people who had been ground down slowly enough that they'd almost stopped noticing it. The Flemings arrived together with the Reyes family, who had lost the most acreage and said the least, which Ethan had learned in his years was usually the combination that produced the most dangerous kind of determination. By the time the last family settled in, there were 23 people in that church who had individually believed for years that they were alone. Ethan stood at the front with the oilcloth-wrapped documents in his hands, and he looked out at those faces, and he thought about Robert Harper, who had never lived to see this moment, but had spent years building toward it anyway. And he thought that was the particular cruelty and grace of that kind of man. They built things they would never get to see. Finished. "I'm not going to give you a speech," he said. "I'm going to read you documents, real ones, names, dates, amounts. And when I'm done reading, I want anyone who recognizes their own situation in what I've read to say so." He paused. "You don't have to say anything tonight, but I want you to know that if you do, you won't be saying it alone." He read. He read slowly and clearly, the way he'd been trained to present evidence without editorial comment, without emphasis beyond what the words themselves carried. He read the names of the forged land deeds and their real owners. He read the bank transfer records, the amounts that had moved from Hale's Western Valley Land and Trust into accounts registered to shell companies that traced back with enough patience to Caleb Greer's family members. He read the names of the county commissioners who'd signed off on false condemnations. He read the dates and amounts of payments to 2 state legislators. The room was completely silent. Not the silence of people waiting. The silence of people hearing something confirmed that they had known in their bones for years and had been told over and over was their imagination. When he finished, Tom, the blacksmith, said in a voice like gravel shifting, "My brother's name in there." Ethan looked down at the last page. "James Briggs," he said. "He filed a formal complaint with the county land office in March of 1882. 3 weeks later, the complaint was withdrawn. The withdrawal is signed with his name." He paused. "The handwriting doesn't match his signature on the original filing." Tom Briggs made a sound low in his throat. "My brother never withdrew that complaint," he said. "My brother disappeared in April of 1882. No one in the room said anything. No one needed to. Then Elena Reyes, who had not said a single word since she'd walked in, stood up from her seat and spoke in the level, precise English of a woman who had learned the language specifically so she could use it in moments like this one. "My husband's name is in those land deeds," she said. "Our farm, our deed. The signature on the transfer document is not my husband's signature. I know my husband's signature." She looked at Ethan. "I have always known." One by one they stood. Not dramatically, not with speeches or theatrics, but with the specific weighted simplicity of people who were done sitting. The Suttons identified their condemned property in the records. Gerald Marsh admitted haltingly but completely that Greer had pressured him to report customers who asked too many questions about land ownership. A woman in the back named Clara Whitfield said that her husband had been told his water rights had been legally transferred to a Hale company, and that he'd believed it for 3 years, because the paperwork looked real, and no one had ever shown him what real paperwork was supposed to look like. Margaret Harper sat beside her children and said nothing yet. She was listening with the same full-body attention her daughter used, taking it all in, and her expression was doing a thing that was not easy to watch. The thing a person's face does when they understand fully and finally that their husband's death was not the end of something, but the price paid to start something that was still unfinished. Lucy's hand was in hers. Noah sat on Margaret's other side with his jaw set and his eyes moving between Ethan and the door. He was watching the door because Ethan had asked him to, and Lucy was listening to everything beyond it. She spoke quietly and directly to Noah without turning her head. Someone just crossed the street outside, stopped at the corner. Noah looked at Ethan. Ethan kept his voice level and continued addressing the room. "What we have here tonight is the foundation of a federal case," he said. "These documents are complete enough to open an investigation that reaches past Caleb Greer, past Douglas Hale, all the way up the chain to the men who authorized and funded this operation from the beginning." He looked out at the faces. "I need signed statements from everyone in this room who's willing to give one. Written testimonies to accompany these documents when they go east." He paused. "I won't pretend there's no risk in that. I won't tell you. Greer won't push back. But I will tell you that by morning, these documents are going to be in the hands of a federal marshal I trust personally. And once that happens, the only question is whether the people of Silver Creek stood up to be counted." The door opened. Not slowly, not politely. It opened the way doors open when the person on the other side is making a point about who has the authority to open doors in this town. Caleb Greer was a big man in the way of men who had been physically imposing once and had since added the particular weight of unchallenged authority on top of the original frame. He was wearing his badge and his sidearm, and the specific expression of a man who had walked into rooms and shut them down for years and saw no reason tonight should be different. He had 4 deputies behind him, and Douglas Hale stood just behind his right shoulder with his banker's coat and his calculating eyes, reading the room the way he'd been reading rooms his whole career, looking for the exits, the weaknesses, the angles. The church went very still. Greer looked at Ethan. He let the silence stretch the way a man stretches it when he wants to remind people who controls the silence. Then he said, "I'm going to need you to hand over those documents." "No," Ethan said. Greer's eyes didn't change. "Son, I am the county sheriff of—" "I know who you are," Ethan said. "Your name is in those documents 11 separate times. Your family members' names appear in the transfer records for 3 land parcels that belong to people in this room." He kept his voice exactly level. "You have no legal authority to seize evidence in a case in which you are the primary subject." Greer's jaw tightened. He looked slowly around the room at the families at Tom Briggs with his apron and his grief at Elena Reyes still standing at Margaret Harper, sitting with her children. "These people don't know what they're getting into," he said. He was still talking to Ethan, but he was performing it for the room, and everyone knew it. "You've come in here with a dead man's grudge and a bag of papers, and you've riled up good families who've got enough trouble already without—" "My husband's land deed is in that bag," Elena Reyes said from the back. Greer turned. "My husband's signature was forged on a transfer document," she said. "I have known this for 2 years. Tonight is the first time I have said it out loud in front of witnesses." She sat down deliberately and without hurry. "I will say it again in writing." Greer stared at her. Then Clara Whitfield stood up. "My water rights," she said simply. "You took them and told my husband it was legal." Then one of the Sutton sons, the eldest, stood up and said nothing. Just stood up, which in that moment said everything. Then Gerald Marsh stood. He stood up slowly with the gravity of a man who had been carrying a weight for a long time and was choosing very consciously to put it down. His voice shook slightly, but it held. "I reported the Harper family to your office," he said, looking directly at Greer. "You told me it was my civic duty. You said Robert Harper was causing problems." He stopped. His jaw worked. "Robert Harper was keeping records that are now in this room. I reported a good man to protect my store, and I have not slept a full night since." He looked around at the other families. "I'm sorry," he said. "To all of you, I'm sorry." Lucy, sitting beside her mother, turned her face toward Gerald Marsh's voice. "He means it," she said quietly to no one in particular. Just said it into the room. Several people looked at her. This small blind child with her clear gray eyes and her lunchbox on her knees. And something in the room shifted, something indefinable but real, the way the balance in a room shifts when everyone present simultaneously understands the same thing. Greer felt it. Even he felt it. Ethan could see it in the slight involuntary change in his posture, not retreat. Not yet, but the first acknowledgement that the terrain was not what he had expected. Hale leaned forward and said something quietly into Greer's ear. Greer's eyes moved to the documents in Ethan's hands. "Those papers leave this building," Greer said, "and I will arrest every person in this room for conspiracy to defraud the county." "On what evidence?" Ethan said. "On my word," Greer said. "Which is the law in this county?" "Not after tonight," Tom Briggs said. The room didn't erupt. It didn't need to. What happened was quieter and more final. It was the sound of 23 people deciding in the same moment that they were no longer afraid of the answer that word carried. Greer could feel it. Ethan could see him feeling it. The thing that had kept this operation running for years was not guns or legal documents or money. It was fear, and fear only works when the people it's applied to believe it's the only option. The moment they stop believing that, it stops working entirely. "Caleb?" Hale's voice was sharp and quiet, a warning. And then the door at the side of the church opened. The deputy who came through it was young, late 20s, with the kind of face that hadn't yet been fully shaped by who it had chosen to work for. He was one of Greer's 4 men who had walked in. He had apparently stepped out through the side and come back through it, and he was carrying a folded paper in his hand. He walked straight past Greer without looking at him and held the paper out to Ethan. "My name is Deputy Samuel Cole," he said loud enough for the room to hear. "I've been writing down dates and amounts for 6 months. Things I've seen, orders I've been given." His voice was steady but just barely. "I wrote it up tonight before I came in." He held Ethan's gaze. "I want it added to what you're sending east." The silence after that was absolute. Greer turned and looked at his deputy the way a man looks at something he can't immediately process. Hale's face went the particular controlled blank of someone who is doing very fast arithmetic. Ethan took the paper. He didn't break eye contact with Greer as he took it. "Thank you, Deputy Cole," he said. "What do you think you're doing?" Greer said to Cole, in a voice stripped of everything except the raw warning underneath it. Cole looked at him. He was 28 years old, and his hands were not completely steady, and he knew clearly what the personal cost of this moment was going to be. "Something I should have done a year ago, sir," he said. Lucy made a small sound. Not words, just a sound the kind a person makes when they set something down that they've been holding for too long. Like relief. Like recognition. Greer stood very still, and in that stillness, Ethan watched the man realize what had changed. It was the realization that every man like Greer eventually reaches, if they stay in a room long enough, the moment when the math stops adding up in their favor, and they have to decide whether to push through it or step back. Hale made the decision for him, which was probably how it had always worked. "Caleb," he said quietly, "we're leaving." "Douglas, we are leaving," Hale said, with the specific authority of the man who had always been the real structure behind the operation. "Tonight. Right now." Greer looked around the room one last time. He looked at the families. He looked at his deputy standing with Ethan. He looked at Lucy, small and blind, and impossibly calm, with her dead father's lunchbox on her knees. He looked at it for a moment longer than everything else, and Ethan saw something move across the man's face that was not remorse, but was the thing that stands closest to it in men who don't have remorse, the awareness that something is finished. He turned and walked out. Hale followed. 2 of the remaining deputies followed Greer. The third stood where he was and looked at Cole and then at Ethan and said haltingly, "I've got a family." "I know," Ethan said. I need people to know I've got a family," the man said. "I did things I shouldn't have. I knew things I should have said." He stopped. His voice dropped. "What do I do now?" "You start with the truth," Ethan said. "That's always where it starts." The room exhaled. Not all at once, in stages, in the rippling way that a held breath releases when the immediate danger has passed, But the body isn't quite sure yet. People looked at each other. Some of them, for the first time, really looked not the careful not seeing of people who had been trained to stay separate. Tom Briggs crossed the room and sat down beside Elena Reyes, and they spoke quietly. Two people who had each lost something irreplaceable and had just discovered they had lost it to the same hand. Margaret Harper stood up and came to Ethan. She didn't say anything immediately. She looked at the documents in his hands, at Cole's folded paper on top of them, at the faces of the people in the room. "It's enough, isn't it?" she said. "Robert built enough." "Yes," Ethan said. "He did." She nodded slowly. Something in her face moved in a way that was private and enormous, and not for the room. Then she straightened, and when she spoke again, her voice was steady and clear. "Then let's get it written," she said. "Every statement, every name, tonight before anything changes." She looked around at the families. "We've waited long enough." Lucy's voice came from behind them, small and certain in the quieting room. "They're not coming back tonight," she said. "I can't hear any horses on the road toward town." A pause. "But I hear something else." Everyone went still. "What do you hear?" Noah asked. Lucy tilted her face slightly upward, listening. Then a slow, wondering look crossed her face, the expression of a child hearing something for the first time, something that she recognized as different from everything she'd been hearing in this town for days. "People talking," she said, "on the street, a lot of them." She paused. "They don't sound afraid." Ethan moved to the window. Outside in the cold Montana dark, the street that had been carefully empty when they'd walked to the church was not empty anymore. Families stood in clusters. People who had not been in the church, who had heard the sheriff walk in and walk back out, who had perhaps been watching from windows for months and years, and had come out now tentatively testing the air, the way you test ice before you trust your weight to it. Silver Creek was waking up, not loudly, not with torches and proclamations. Quietly, the way the real things always happen, one person standing beside another, and then another, and then another, until the space that fear had kept empty was full of something else entirely. Ethan stood at that window and looked at it, and felt for the first time in 3 years the specific weight of a thing that was not grief and not guilt, and not the numb road distance he'd been carrying since the fire. It was something older than all of that. Something he'd thought he'd put down permanently. He was still standing there when Lucy's hand found his, again 2 fingers wrapped with that small and certain grip. "They came," she said. "They came," he agreed. The statements took until past midnight. Ethan sat at the front of that church with a borrowed pen and stack of paper that Gerald Marsh had run back to the feed store to retrieve, and he wrote everything down in the careful, precise hand of a man trained to document things that had to survive scrutiny. Each family told their story in their own words, and he recorded it faithfully, not editorializing, not softening, not shaping it into anything other than exactly what it was. The Suttons, the Flemings, Elena Reyes, who dictated in both English and Spanish, and asked that both versions be included because she wanted there to be no question about what she meant. Tom Briggs, who gave his testimony about his brother James in a voice so controlled it was almost frightening, and who signed his name at the bottom with a finality that looked like the last period at the end of a very long sentence. Deputy Samuel Cole gave his statement separately in full and added 3 names that weren't in Robert Harper's documents, county officials who had received payments in the last year alone, payments Cole had personally witnessed being made. When he finished, he sat back and looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and discovered partway down that he could fly. Shaky and astonished, and not entirely sure what came next. "What happens to me now?" he asked Ethan quietly. "That depends on what you do from here," Ethan said honestly. "Cooperating with a federal investigation carries weight. You were following orders you shouldn't have followed, but you followed them. What matters now is the same thing that always matters: what you do with what you know." Cole looked at the statement in Ethan's hands. "I should have done this a year ago," he said. "Probably," Ethan said. "But you did it tonight, in front of witnesses. That counts." Margaret Harper worked alongside Ethan the entire time, organizing cross-referencing matching testimony against the documents with the systematic efficiency of a woman who had spent years beside a man who'd taught her how this kind of case was built. She didn't cry once. She didn't break once. She moved through the work the way water moves through a channel that's finally been cleared, steady and purposeful, and with the full force of everything that had been held back behind it. At some point past 1 a.m, Lucy fell asleep against Noah's shoulder in the front pew. Noah sat very still, so she wouldn't wake his hand resting on her hair, watching his mother work with an expression that was too old for his face and too young for his eyes. And that was the exact and particular expression of someone learning in real time what their parents were actually made of. Just before 2 a.m, Margaret set the last organized page on top of the stack and looked at Ethan. "It's ready," she said. "It is," he said. "You said you have someone you trust to send it to." "Marshall out of Billings," Ethan said. "Name's Warren Cross. We worked 3 cases together before I left the service. He's an honest man, which in this business means he's also a stubborn one." He paused. "He'll move on this." "How long?" Margaret asked. "Week, maybe 10 days before he can get a team out here," Ethan said. "Greer and Hale will know by morning that last night didn't go the way they planned. They'll be calculating their options." He looked at the stack of documents and statements. "Once this package leaves Silver Creek, their calculation changes. Running looks better to them than fighting, and running leaves evidence behind." "And if they don't run," Margaret said. Ethan looked at her steadily. "Then there are 23 families in this town who've given signed statements, a deputy who's turned, and a former federal ranger who's been in worse situations than a cornered, corrupt sheriff." He said it without bravado, just the plain accounting of the situation. "They won't touch this town with what we've built tonight. Not without making everything worse for themselves." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "Robert would have trusted you." Ethan didn't know what to say to that. He rarely didn't know what to say. "He built something worth trusting," he said finally. She nodded. Just once. And that was enough. The package went east on the first morning stage out of Silver Creek, carried by Gerald Marsh himself, who had volunteered with the particular intensity of a man doing penance and meaning it. Ethan had written a cover letter to Warren Cross that laid out the structure of the case in the clear numbered language of a federal filing, and he'd sealed the whole thing inside 2 layers of oilcloth and addressed it with Cross's full title, so that anyone handling it along the way would understand that intercepting it carried federal consequences. Greer knew the stage had left. Ethan was certain of that. But Greer didn't stop it. That told him everything he needed to know about how Greer was reading the situation. A man who intended to fight stops the stage. A man who is calculating his exits lets it go and spends the morning in quiet, urgent conversation with his banker. By mid-morning, Douglas Hale's horse was gone from the livery. By early afternoon, 2 of the remaining deputies had quietly stopped wearing their badges. By the time the sun dropped below the western ridge, Caleb Greer's office was dark, and his personal effects were gone, and Silver Creek was for the first time in years a town without a functioning corrupt sheriff, which meant it was also a town without any functioning law at all, which was frightening in one way and clarifying in another. Tom Briggs stepped into that gap without being asked. He organized a volunteer watch from the men willing to serve, posted them at the key points, and did it with the quiet authority of someone who had been waiting for the moment to be useful in the right way. Gerald Marsh opened his store early and kept it open late, and people came in not just for feed and dry goods, but to talk, which they hadn't done freely in a long time. And the talking mattered as much as anything else. Elena Reyes came to Ethan on the second morning and said without preamble, "When can we go back to our land?" "When the federal order comes through restoring the deeds," Ethan said. 2, maybe 3 weeks. She looked at him. "I have been waiting 2 years," she said. 3 more weeks I can wait." She paused. "My husband will want to thank you." "Thank Robert Harper," Ethan said. "He did the work." She considered that for a moment. "Then we will name something after him. she said, with the absolute finality of a woman who has decided a thing. "When we rebuild, we will name something after him." Ethan thought that Robert Harper would have been embarrassed by that, and quietly proud of it in roughly equal measure. The federal marshal's reply came in 8 days, which was 2 days faster than Ethan had expected, and told him that Warren Cross had read that letter and moved immediately. The wire said a team was coming, that warrants were being prepared, that Greer and Hale had already been identified in Helena trying to liquidate assets, and that their attempted liquidation had been flagged and frozen by a judge who it turned out was not on their list of purchased officials, and was extremely displeased to discover that some of his colleagues were. Ethan read the wire twice, and then walked to the Harper farm, or what remained of it, which was the stone foundation and 2 standing walls, and the memory of a home that had been deliberately taken apart, and he stood there for a while by himself. He was thinking about Robert Harper putting those documents together, year after year, quietly, carefully, at great personal risk, building the case that would outlast him, because he understood that it had to outlast him. He was thinking about what it meant to do the right thing without any guarantee of living to see it matter. He was thinking about his own son and his wife and the barn fire and the years of roads between then and now, and whether those years had been running away from something or running towards something he couldn't see yet. He didn't have a clean answer. He wasn't sure there was one, but he was standing on Robert Harper's land, and Robert Harper's family was alive, and the documents were in federal hands, and the families of Silver Creek were beginning to come back to themselves. And he had stopped on a frozen road 4 days ago, because a 4-year-old blind girl was sitting in the snow, and that stop had led to this moment in a chain of events so direct and purposeful that it was difficult standing inside it not to feel like it had been arranged by something larger than any individual decision. He heard footsteps behind him, small ones and then larger ones alongside them. "She knew you'd be here," Noah said from a few feet back. Ethan turned. Lucy was walking with one hand in her brother's and the other stretched slightly forward in that habitual gesture of navigating unfamiliar ground, but she was moving with confidence toward where Ethan stood. Her face was turned toward him like a compass needle finding north. "This is where Daddy used to stand when he was thinking," she said when she reached him. "It smells like ash and old wood and cold dirt." He said it reminded him of what he was working for. She stopped in front of Ethan and tilted her face up toward his. "What are you thinking about?" "Your daddy," Ethan said. Lucy nodded slowly, like that was the expected and correct answer. She was quiet for a moment, her head slightly tilted, the wind moving across her face. "Noah says the marshal is coming," she said. "That's right. And the land is coming back. Our land and the other family's land." "It will," Ethan said. "Takes time to work through the legal process, but it'll come." "And Greer, running," Ethan said, "which is its own kind of justice, and the federal warrant is its own kind of the other kind." Lucy absorbed that. Daddy used to say that justice through the law was better than justice through fists, because fists stop when one man gets tired, but law keeps going after everyone's tired. "Your daddy was a wise man," Ethan said. "He was the best man," she said for the second time, with that same carved-in-stone certainty as the first. Noah was watching Ethan with those sharp mother's eyes of his, the assessment running quietly behind his expression. "What do you do now?" he asked. It was the question Ethan had been circling for days without looking at it directly. He'd spent 3 years with the answer being the next town and the road after, and the particular empty freedom of having nowhere specific to be. He'd carried that answer like it was protection, like having no destination meant having no more to lose. He looked at the burned foundation, at the 2 standing walls, at the land stretching out around it, frozen and dormant, and waiting for spring with the patience that land has that people don't. "Well," he said slowly, "somebody's going to have to stay until the marshal arrives and gives testimony about the documents and the chain of custody." He paused. "Probably take a few weeks at minimum." "Probably." Noah agreed carefully, watching him. "And those walls aren't going to rebuild themselves," Ethan said. Noah was very still. "No," he said. They're not. I know something about building, Ethan said. Spent years on ranches. Did construction work when I was young. He kept his voice even, like he was discussing something practical, rather than the thing he was actually deciding. Reckon a house that size with the right help comes back in 6-8 weeks if the weather holds. Lucy's hand found his coat sleeve. Not grabbing, just resting there the way she'd touched him that first night, with the certainty of someone who already knew the outcome and was just waiting for the other person to catch up. I knew you weren't leaving, she said. I might leave, Ethan said. You might, she said, but not yet, and not the way you thought you would. He looked down at her, this small blind child who could hear lies in a voice, and fear in a footstep, and the weight of a rifle by its sound in a saddle scabbard, and he thought that her father had been right about one thing above all others. Blindness was not the absence of sight. It was a different kind of seeing, turned inward and downward, and toward the things that the sighted spent all their energy looking past. Your daddy sent me a letter in a way, Ethan said. Through you. Through that box. He sent a letter to whoever stopped. Lucy tilted her face up. I want you to know, Ethan said, that I got it. She smiled. It was a full, unguarded smile, the kind a child produces when the thing they have been hoping for has finally actually happened. It was the smile of someone who had sat alone in the snow for 2 days and held onto a lunchbox and believed with the specific and irrational faith that only the very young and the very brave maintain that the world would send someone. The world had sent someone. Margaret Harper came out of the ruins of her house with her coat on and her jaw set, and the look of a woman already calculating how to begin, and she stood beside her children and looked out at the land her husband had died to protect, and said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, Spring comes in 6 weeks. About that, Ethan said. Ground will be workable in 8, she said. There's seed stored in the Reyes barn. They kept our father's winter wheat seed when the house burned. I didn't know until Elena told me last night. She paused. First planting season, this land produces again. It will, Ethan said. She looked at him sidelong. You know anything about wheat? I know something about most things, he said. She almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. Well then, she said. The weeks that followed had their own rhythm, the particular rhythm of people rebuilding something real with their hands and their time and their presence, which is different from every other kind of rhythm, because it accumulates. Every beam placed was a beam that hadn't been there yesterday. Every stone set was a stone that would be there tomorrow. The work was slow, and it was physical, and it was for Ethan Ryder the first thing in 3 years that had required him to be somewhere specific at a specific time, for a reason that was not just motion. He discovered he had needed that more than he had known. Warren Cross arrived with 3 federal agents on a Tuesday, 11 days after the wire, and spent 4 days taking testimony and reviewing documents and establishing the legal foundation for what would become the largest rural land fraud prosecution in Montana territorial history. He shook Ethan's hand and said, I wondered when you'd come back. And Ethan said, I haven't decided if I'm back. And Cross looked at the Harper farm being rebuilt 30 yards away and didn't say anything, which was more eloquent than anything he could have said. Greer was arrested in Helena 2 weeks later. Hale was found in Wyoming trying to cross into Colorado and was taken in quietly by 2 federal marshals who'd been waiting at the border crossing. The state legislators whose names appeared in the documents resigned before warrants reached them, which their lawyers had apparently advised was the better option, and which Cross said would ultimately not protect them as much as their lawyers believed. The land deeds were restored. Not all at once, the legal process moved at its own pace, indifferent to urgency, but in order, family by family. The paperwork came through, and the land came back. Elena Reyes stood on her farm the morning the deed was restored, and stood there for a long time without moving, and her husband stood beside her, and they didn't say anything to each other, and they didn't need to. Tom Briggs hired 2 men and rebuilt his smithy, which had been slowly stripped of work by Greer's quiet economic pressure for years, and on the day he reopened, he posted a sign in the window that said, open to all, which in Silver Creek carried a weight it might not have carried anywhere else. Gerald Marsh stopped looking guilty and started looking like himself, which it turned out was a fairly decent man who had been bent by fear and was now straightening back out slowly and imperfectly the way bent things do. And at the Harper farm, the walls went up. Ethan worked alongside Noah every day, and the boy was strong and fast and learned quickly and talked constantly the way boys do when they finally feel safe enough to use up all the words they've been storing. He talked about his father. He talked about what he wanted to build here. He talked about the families on the East Road, and the Reyes children, and a girl whose name he said once, and then didn't say again carefully, which Ethan noted, and said nothing about. Lucy sat on the porch of the temporary shelter and listened to the construction, the way she listened to everything completely, and with her whole self narrating it internally into a picture that nobody else could see. She asked questions constantly. What wood is that? What does the joint look like when it's right? Why does the hammer sound different on the east wall? She was building the house in her own way, in a medium that had nothing to do with wood and nails, and the house she was building would last longer than the physical one. One evening, close to the end of the 6th week, Ethan sat on the porch steps, in the last of the day's light, and Lucy came and sat beside him, the lunchbox on her knees. "You haven't left," she said. "I haven't," he said. She ran her thumb along the lunchbox clasp, that old habitual gesture. "Are you going to?" He thought about the road. He thought about the next town, and the town after. He thought about the hollow, weightless feeling of moving through a world you've decided not to attach to, and whether that feeling had ever actually protected him from anything, or whether it had just been a more comfortable name for grief. "Not yet," he said. "Not yet," she repeated, turning the words over. "That's different from how you said it before." "Is it?" he said. "Before you said it like a door closing," she said. "Now you say it like a door that's still open." He looked at her. She was 4 years old, and she was right, and she knew she was right, and she was going to grow up into someone extraordinary, and Robert Harper had known that too, and had made sure that the world had a chance to find out. "Your daddy was a good judge of character," Ethan said. "He was the best man," she said for the 3rd time. And then she looked up, not quite at him, but in his direction, with the particular expression she wore when she was saying something that had been settled in her mind for a long time. "You're the second best," she said. Ethan sat with that for a moment. Then he said, "That's a high bar, Lucy May." "I know," she said simply. "You cleared it." The spring came in 5 weeks, not 6. The ground softened, and the Reyes winter wheat seed went into the Harper field in the 1st week of April, and the whole town came out to help plant it. Not because anyone organized them, but because people who have been separated by fear and finally found each other back tend to show up. They worked all day and ate together that evening, the families of Silver Creek, around a fire on the Harper land, and they talked about what had been and what was coming and what they were going to build. Lucy sat in her mother's lap and listened to all of it with her eyes closed, and a small, content expression on her face, the lunchbox on the ground beside her feet, where she could feel it. She didn't need to hold it so tightly anymore. Ethan watched the fire and the families and the rebuilt walls of the Harper house dark against the spring sky, and he thought that this was what Robert Harper had been working toward. Not just the end of the corruption, not just the restoration of the deeds, but this specific thing. People on their own land, knowing each other's names, sitting together in the ordinary and irreplaceable warmth of a community that has remembered what it is. Some men plant trees they'll never sit under. Some men build houses they'll never live in. And some men put documents in a metal lunchbox and press it into the arms of their blind 4-year-old daughter and trust the world to send someone who will understand what to do with them. Robert Harper had trusted the world. And the world slowly, imperfectly, at great cost and through great pain had come through. The people who cannot see the world the way the rest of us see it are sometimes the only ones who see it true. Lucy May Harper had sat in the snow with no eyes to cry with and no voice raised in fear, and no doubt in her heart that someone was coming, and she had been right, because she had always been right, because she saw not with her eyes, but with everything else. And everything else had told her the truth that the rest of Silver Creek had spent years refusing to look at. Justice is not always loud. It does not always arrive on horseback with a badge and a gun. Sometimes it arrives folded in oilcloth inside a child's lunchbox, carried through a Montana winter, in the arms of a little girl who cannot see, but knows with the full and unshakable certainty of someone who has never learned to doubt the things that matter, that the right man will stop. He stopped. And nothing in Silver Creek was ever the same again.